Good to have each of you here this morning at Market Street Church of Christ on this beautiful Sunday morning. We are continuing our study of the book of Genesis here in the auditorium class. And so if you want to go ahead and open up your Bible to Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6 is where we're going to be starting today. In this study of Genesis, we are using a timeline because plan to cover the entire book. It's a big book. If you were to do it verse by verse, it would take a few quarters to be able to do it justice. But we're going to try to cover the whole book in just one quarter, which means we will not be going verse by verse. And today will be one of those where we're not going to be able to, because we're going to be covering, Lord willing, chapter 6 through 11. And that is the new beginning. So the book of Genesis is about beginnings. If we use our outline that we've been using, and I had a request to make this public, I will certainly get this out on our website real soon, so just bear with me. But this is how we have been approaching the class with an outline. There are several beginnings that we see in the book of Genesis. Of course, the beginning of everything, the beginning of all, the creation in chapters 1 and 2. But then we also see the beginning of sin in chapter 3 that we have looked at. And then we saw the beginning of civilization or society. Simply that being whenever man is left the garden and now you have all the different generations and things that come after that. So we are now in that time frame of the beginning of the human race and the beginning of civilization whenever man began agriculture and all the different things that we know today. Well, after several thousand years, however long it was, we don't know specifically, but it was a while, man populated the earth, began to propagate all around the world, and as we're going to see here in just a few moments, evil prevailed. So God decides that he is sorry he made man and decides he's going to destroy the earth and man with a flood. And so that's why this particular section chapter 6 through 11 is called a new beginning or a fresh beginning. We're going to start over again. And as you can see, there are several other beginnings that we will look at as we move through these chapters. So let's open our Bibles to Genesis chapter 6. And in Genesis chapter 6, we have this new beginning. We've already have the beginning of everything, the beginning of sin and the beginning of civilization, but now there's a new beginning. So beginning in chapter 6, verse 1. Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they were beautiful. And they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. And there were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, they bore children to them. They were mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Then the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent and thoughts of the heart was only evil continually. Now the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. So before we dive into some of the things that are in this text, this right here shows you the actions or in fact, this is what I'm going to be speaking about this morning, the ripple effect of sin. Here we see the consequences of sin all this time later. The one choice that Adam and Eve made has now come to fruition, and it has those consequences. So, what do we have? We have lots of people on the earth, and there are many calculations that have been done, and there are some that say there were as many as 7 billion people on the planet at this time whenever God says he wants to destroy the earth. Different calculations come up with different things, so you take those with a grain of salt. But the main thing that we want to take from this is that something was wrong. As he says, all of the intents and thoughts of the heart was on evil continually. So with that in mind, you look back at a couple of verses that people struggle with and that people have made a lot out of that's really more than they should. And that is the part about the men taking wives, the sons of God and the daughters of men, and them taking wives for themselves. And then in verse 4, there were these things on the earth. Some of your Bibles have a different word there? Nephilim. All right, Nephilim. And so if you look up Nephilim on the internet, oh man, you're going to get all kinds of interesting things. But many of them are just wild fantasy. They're myths. They're trying to put something in that is not there. So there have been some that have said these were angels that came down and had children with mankind. And some of people say, oh, well, what about these fallen angels, Satan? And they had children with flesh. That's where all this comes from. Well, first of all, nowhere does angels or demons show to be married. In fact, in Matthew chapter 22, verse 30, Jesus himself says that angels are not given in marriage. So you never see that connection. And then if you look at sons of God, back in verse 2, that's never applied to angels or to demons at any time. And so the real answer to what is this all about is we don't really know. Okay? This was long before our time. This is all the information we have. The main thing you need to understand is verse 5, the fact that the intents and thoughts of the heart were on evil continually. So there was something about the ones who should be those sons of God, that's what we're called, in fact, in Christianity, were intermingling with those that were not. And so whatever it was, it turned into evil across the earth. Any thoughts, questions, concerns about that passage? Yes, go ahead.
In verse 4, when it says the sons of God came in unto the daughters, does not necessarily mean that they were married.
That's true. That's a great point. Doesn't necessarily mean they were married. They could have just been propagating through fornication or something like that. Great point. The point being is, as I said, verse 5 is here is what is called judicial hardening of the heart. This is the beginning of when man's heart begins to be hardened. And why is man's heart hardened? Yes, the Bible says multiple times that God hardened, for example, Pharaoh's heart. But did God actually physically reach in and harden the heart? It's a result of choices that mankind makes. And so this is your first time you see this, where man's hardening his heart and God is sorry. And it's interesting, God says that God is sorry in his heart. Simple question, is God a man? No. So this is personification. There's a fancier word for it, but personification of God to help us understand what he's going through. All right, so with that being said, we get into a golden verse, verse 8. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. I love the way that is stated. He found grace. What does grace mean, y'all? Unmerited favor. He found favor in God's eyes. And so Noah found this favor in his eyes, and it says this is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. And so that is the second time we see this idea of how they walked with God. If you look back in chapter 5, it talks about Enoch, and Enoch walked with God. What do you think walked with God means? What implication what can you infer from that? Obedient to his will. Walking with God means the same thing today as it did all these thousands of years ago. So whenever John, the apostle, says, let us walk in the light as he is in the light, it's exactly what's being said right here. It means being obedient. It means being submissive, submitting to the will of God. And Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them from the face of the earth. Now, this is also what is known as the patriarch period, or era. There are 3, we call them dispensations, of time throughout the Bible, and it is the patriarchal era, the Mosaical era, and then the Christian era. And during the patriarchal, we call it that because God spoke directly to the fathers, the early fathers of humanity, of religion, which you're going to see in the next section with Abraham. And so here you can imagine God is speaking directly to mankind, various men. You saw him speak to Adam. You saw him speak to Cain. Now he's speaking to Noah. And could you imagine receiving the news that you have found favor in my eyes, God speaking to Noah, and then saying, and so much so, I'm going to destroy the entire world except for you and your family and some creatures. That's a pretty heavy load, don't you think? And so we sometimes need to step back and realize these are real people with real events who has the same emotions that you and I have. Mankind has not changed in all of creation. The heart's still the same. The relationship between mankind and God is the same. The only thing that is different about us and Noah is the clothes we wear, the tongue we speak, and a few other things like that, and the fact that God speaks directly to them. So it would be something to hear, you have found favor in my sight, but I'm going to destroy the entire world. Now we get into chapter 6, verses 14 through forward. We get into the ark being made. I know it says chapter 7 up there, but really it starts back here. Because once again, the people who put the chapters and verses in place, as I always say, I think he was drunk and on a horse when he was doing it, because he just randomly puts these numbers there. Really, chapter 7 should start here in verse 14. So here he says, make yourself an ark. So now we're getting into the commands that God is giving to Moses. Now in my Bible, I like to highlight. I highlight, I underline, I write, I circle, everything I can do to help me decipher everything that's going on to get a good, clear picture in my mind. And so as you can see, there's different highlights. And for me, blue is the color that means command or law. And so here God is giving a command, and it's very important what he says and what happens. He says, make an ark, and then he says, this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, as width 50 cubits, its height 30 cubits, and you shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark on its side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. Then he goes to explain, you also will take all these animals in there. And I want you to pay attention to what he says in verse 19. He says, and take of every living thing of all flesh. Flesh. So what does that exclude? If we're thinking about living creatures, what does that exclude? Plants. There you go. Plants. That's not flesh. You might consider also that it doesn't say anything about aquatic animals. Noah didn't need to bring all the different types of fish and everything onto the ark. It says flesh, breathing flesh. And he goes and he says, birds of the air, animals after their kind, every creeping thing after the earth of its kind, 2 of every kind will come to you, and you will keep them alive. Now, there's an interesting theory that goes along with this, and one of those is that he did not, for example, Noah did not need to bring every single kind of dog that has ever existed. Let's just use that as an example. I'm not saying there was a bunch of breeds back then, but he didn't need to bring every kind of dog. He just needed to bring a pair of canines. Because what comes out of the canines? You have dogs, you have wolves, and other canines that come out of them, right? So that's one of the ways that we can get in our minds how God is able to fit, or Noah is able to fit all these animals onto the ark. And if you've ever been up to the ark, which I haven't, I've just heard stories, I've read about it, but if you go up to the ark, they explain it in great detail that yes, it is very possible to get all species of living things onto a vessel like an ark. But then there's one other aspect of this that we often overlook or don't think about, considering the fact of what's happening here. And that is who's involved with this ark business. Not just Noah and his family, but who else? The Creator. Do not recommend the movie, is it Noah? I think with Russell Crowe. Terrible movie, but interesting in the fact that there is one thing that I did appreciate about the movie. A couple of things I appreciated. One, I do believe it's just a big giant box. And then second of all, that all of a sudden when Noah was working, you hear this rumble and stuff, and all of a sudden here come all these animals. That's exactly how I pictured it. God just simply said, go, and the various animals are going to go. It's not like Noah had to go out. Maybe he did, but not like he had to go out and go gather up, 2 of these animals, and then go over here and get 2 of these animals, and go over here and get 2 more. God's involved. And so all these animals come at God's command. And one of the things I remember about that show is whenever all the bugs were coming and the flies and stuff, and I think it was Noah's wife was like, oh no, not the bugs. Right? So why did he have to bring mosquitoes? So anyway, so there is miracles that could be involved in this as well. But here's the main thing I want you to take from this chapter. What does verse 22 say? Very important verse, needs to be highlighted in your Bibles. According to all that God commanded. That's a golden verse, y'all. Thus did Noah. Thus Noah did according to all that God commanded. God said, do this. Excuse me. And Noah did it all. He didn't. That's why Noah found favor in God's eyes, because he was obedient and he did exactly what God told him to do. Now, there are lots of different thoughts and ideas about the ark. There are some who think that it looks like this. It looks like what would be one of our modern boats. In fact, the one up in Kentucky, this is the model that they use, and they think that that big thing sticking up, it worked kind of like a sail to keep it going straight. Others think that it was more like this. This is the more classic view of the ark. And then there's others who, I personally think this is just a big box. He just didn't have to do anything except the dimensions are the most important thing. And the decks, notice that he also says you shall make it with so many decks. And then the window, is it just literally one single window or one big long window? Or what is it in regards to that window? But either way, the point being is as you can see there, it's supposed to be 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. And you may be thinking, well, what is a cubit? Well, a cubit, for most of the Old Testament, is simply a measurement of from your tip of your elbow to the tip of your fingers. And that is usually around 18 inches. And there's all kinds of other measurements that are in there as well, which is the span of your fingers, and I forget how many there are, but I think it's 6 of this in a cubit, so 6 spans of the finger, and then there's also this span, and I think there's 2 in that. So there's all kinds of ways that they measured. And then they took those cubits and they took those into rods and into furlongs and everything else. So about 18 inches. And yes, there are variances in that. just like the imperial foot is 12 inches. So there's all kinds of stories and historical things. I'm sure Billy could probably tell you about the history of where we get our imperial measurements from. But this is where we get the measurements that we're talking about in the Bible. So if you have 300 times 18 inches, let's just round up. I mean, maybe Noah was a small man and is only 16 and a half inches. We don't know. Or maybe he's a taller man. But either way, about 18 inches. That comes out to 5,400 inches divided by 12 is a length of 450 feet. So now you can get in your brain how big this ark is. And if you are anything like most people in here that think about in terms of sports, a football field is 300 feet long. So that's a football field and a half of how long this would be. Or if you want to compare it to the size of a 747 airplane, you can see the difference there versus the Titanic. I don't know why they always use the Titanic, because we don't know, we don't see the Titanic. But there it is as far as the size of what this ark would be. All right, so Noah did everything that God commanded. Any thoughts, comments up to this point? Yes.
Well, from our perspective, it was miraculous that all those animals showed up.
Yes.
God may have just simply given them direction, and
Yeah.
they had the ability to,
Yeah.
But he didn't. God made the animals show up one way or the other. But he didn't just poof, make two animals right there on the spot and say, okay, take those.
Right.
And after the flood, he could have said, okay, make a boat big enough just for you and your family.
Yep.
And then when the waters go away, I'll make everybody else again. I'll
Yeah.
make all the animals again. And he didn't do that.
All right.
He just had them show up, and Moses had the responsibility
Of multiplying and
continue following through, like it says in 22,
yeah.
verse 22, to continue following all the God's commands.
Yeah.
He didn't just do it for him. Noah had stuff to do with the animals himself.
Exactly. You see that as well. Come right back to you, Jack. You see that as well in the next chapter, chapter 7, whenever he says, come in the ark, and he tells him to bring not only those two animals, but also the food for those animals. And he also says, bring 7 of every clean animal, and that's because there's going to be a sacrifice once they come to the end of the flood. And I often think about those poor animals. They were, this is God's command, but it's my mind sometimes. They survived the flood to be burned on an altar, but that was God's command. Yes, Jack?
Years ago, Cool pointed out that the armed forces use those measurements for the ark to build the Liberty ships.
Yes. The proportions of that ship are perfect for buoyancy and everything. So even in that, to this day, you can still use those same proportions. Every ship is essentially built to the same proportions as the ark. It might be bigger, but the width compared to the height and everything else is the same in order to get proper buoyancy. Great point. All right, so then he has all the animals. They go into the ark, and then beginning in verse 11 of chapter 7, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month of the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. If you look at that, and really you back up to verse 10, they were already on the ark for 7 days whenever you come into that 600 year, verse 11. And then you see, if you go to the end of chapter 7, let me point this out real quick. Verse 20 of chapter 7, the waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, and all whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life. All that was on the dry land died. I find that interesting because back in chapter 6, he says, my spirit shall not strive with man forever. And so here you see the Spirit of life. It's only because of God's grace that we have air that we can breathe. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground. And then in verse 24, the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. You go down to verse 3. At the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. I want you to jump over to verse 13. It came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, in the first day of the second month, the waters were dried up from the earth. And then verse 14, in the second month of the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. So going real quick there through the chronology, if you stop and look at all the things that the Bible gives us about the flood, we learn that essentially the earth was flooded for 1 year. So when Noah was 600 years old, just the thought of that alone blows my mind, doesn't it? 600 years. That means that people from, when would that be? The 1400s? No, 1500s. So all the people like Michelangelo, Michelangelo would be building the ark. That's about how old, if I'm calculating it right. 600 years ago. Could you imagine? So this man, 600 years old, builds this ark, and he goes in when he's 600 years old and gives the exact time, the month and the day. And then it says that on the 601st year, and we wind up in the second month, and then 10 days later, essentially the flood came and flooded the entire world for about a year and 10 days, a year and 17 days. It depends on how you calculate a little bit. So here's a chart that I found. So up there at the top, you can see that 600th year of Noah's life. And then the 601st year, we're getting into 2 months. And then all the various verses that you can see there where God orders him to go into the ark in chapter 7, verse 1. You see where the ark floats in chapter 7, verse 12. And then all the way to the end where Noah leaves the ark in chapter 8, verse 14. And then all the breakdown of the various days. You might notice that some of those numbers are red. And that is because it all depends on how you count. There are some variances in some of the things that are said as far as, well, how many days is that, or when are we counting from? And so that's why there's some variances there in red. But that tells you how long they were in the ark. And if you think about that, some of you have been on cruises before, right? And you ate well while you were on those cruises, but you were on those cruises for what? Week, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks at the most. Imagine having to feed someone, a family, Noah's family, and all those animals for an entire year. That would be something, wouldn't it? That's a lot of provision. That's a long time in a very small space, right? That space would get smaller and smaller and smaller as the days go by. So can you imagine spending an entire year, and then just no telling what it must have been like here in the water, slurping around or something like that. The old get your sea legs thing and all. Just man, we read over sometimes the Bible and we know the story of Noah and the flood, but we need to come back and put it into personal application of how we might feel if we were in Noah's shoes. Thoughts, comments?
I keep going back to, it says he followed all of God's commands. And I'm just thinking, my boss comes to me and says, Jared, I want you to do this. And I'm like, all right, hang on. Let me write it down. And I don't know if he wrote it down, it doesn't say, but just how he got the exact dimensions.
Yes.
Right, especially after he said it's going to rain and it's never rained. I mean,
Great point.
something shocking like that, and everything you tell me after that, I'm not even listening to. I'm still trying to comprehend the first thing you said.
Yeah, exactly. Completely agree. And one of the great things about him fulfilling everything is notice that we don't have details on certain things. All we know is that it had to be this dimension and it had to be made out of a certain kind of wood, right? So did he use saws? Did he use hammers? Did he use cranes? What did he use? So this becomes one of the things we see when we're talking about commands versus expediency. We are, for example, commanded to take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week, right? But Jesus didn't say exactly how to do that. We know we're supposed to have fruit of the vine and unleavened bread. Beyond that, Are we supposed to all get up and walk up here to the table and gather around the table like his disciples were gathered? Or can we use these implements that we're using to spread it out? Do we use one cup or a whole bunch of cups? You see what I mean? When it comes to expediency, there are things that we have to make a judgment call. And that's what happened with Noah, going back to your point, great point, is that he had to make some judgment calls. All he knew was this, this, and this, as well as what's not recorded. Maybe God said, here's a set of blueprints for you. You don't know. But it's a great point.
Chapter 6, verse 11, we're talking about the fountains of the deep.
Yeah.
ESV says the great deep.
Uh-huh.
Well, it's two things that show the divine revelation of the Scripture. How would anybody back then have known there was going to be fountains
Yeah.
of fresh water, period, way under the water?
Enough water to flood the entire earth over the mountains.
And so there are springs, the hot springs, that can be thousands of feet deep in the ocean, and submersibles that take pictures of them. The other thing is, it's just been really this year, scientists have determined there's actually more water trapped in Earth's rock, more than 2 times than all the oceans combined, water trapped in the Earth's crust underground. So if even a fraction of that was released, that's the water that could have covered
Yeah.
any mountain on Earth.
That's right. Good point. The scientific foreknowledge of the Bible. All right, so as we continue now looking at what has happened here, we see where the ark and the flood, and in chapter 8 we see where the flood subsides, and there's an important point you need to see in verse 20 of chapter 8. Noah built an altar to the Lord. He took every clean animal, there's those extra animals that he took, and every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. Then the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake. Although, you need to underline this, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. So we have a natural tendency or inclination to lean towards evil, to make evil choices. And then this all harmonizes perfectly with what you see in Scripture. That's the reason why Adam and Eve made their decision. It's the reason why Cain killed his brother. And you're going to see this over and over and over. What it does not say, and hear me clearly, it does not say you are evil from your birth, as in some doctrines like to say in Psalm 51 and things like that. It just says from your youth. And isn't that interesting? When is it that someone becomes aware? We have a name for it. When they become aware of good and evil. Age of accountability. And I love that phrase because when I hear it, the age of accountability to God is how I see that. So here he says, he knows the heart of man. And this also teaches us about free will and choice. That's why the Bible is full of the word if you obey my commands. If you choose me, I put before you life and death. Choose life. So over and over and over we see free will. And once again, Noah did everything that he was supposed to do. So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to him, chapter 9, verse 1, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. Like Paul said earlier, God could have just said, boop, there's all new plants, all new animals, all everything, and fill the earth. But he said, no, you go fill the earth. Then we see in verse 8, then God spoke to Noah and his sons and said, as for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you. Verse 10, I will establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. And my Bible has a colon right here. Now here's the sign. Verse 13, I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. So the reason we have rainbows is because God said, I will never do that again. I did it once, I'd do it again. There's another interesting theory behind the flood, and that is before the flood there was no rain, that there was perhaps this kind of mist on the ground that kept everything watered and stuff like that. And you also have a complete change in the whole metaphysical dynamic of the human body, because before the flood people were living to be 800-900 years old, and after the flood all of a sudden you see everything get to where we are today. Also the advent of disease and all kinds of other things that happened since the flood. So one quick point, and I'll come right back to you, Mike, is I want to make is the rainbow pride flag. The rainbow belongs to God, not to pride. And it's rather ironic that they use a symbol that God used to destroy the earth because of man's intent and the evil that is in his heart. Find that rather ironic that they use that flag. But that shows you exactly why God did it, because of rebellion. Yes?
Verse 4, you might have commented on it and I missed it.
Okay. Verse 4, but you shall not, okay, thanks, I did not say a word. You shall not eat flesh with its life, that is the blood. Surely your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, from the hand of man, and from the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. He goes on later in the law of Moses in Leviticus and gives a specific law. It says, you shall not eat blood. It is, in fact, Leviticus 11 verse 17, the blood is the life of man. This is what gives us life. Without blood, you don't live. You shall not eat it. And there's a reason for that, because there's a future reference that is looking forward to what is it that redeems man from his sin? Blood. All right, you see that in the altar itself. That blood is precious, and God is teaching us, if you will, how precious that blood is and what he's going to do to redeem man back to himself by giving the blood of his own son. Blood's important. Now, there are people today who eat blood sausage and will eat the blood and everything, saying, well, we're not under the old covenant. Fine, I'm not doing it. I think it's disgusting. I do not like, in Paraguay there was blood sausage. It's horrible stuff, and it's like, just not going to do it. Any more thoughts, comments?
Well, that doesn't Acts, I know Acts 15.
Yes.
At least twice.
Yes.
And that's what the Jews ended, don't eat blood.
Yes. And I follow that. I think God's not changed, and so, yeah. Good point, Josh. All right, so we continue now. If we look, whenever the ark came down on Mount Ararat, we don't know exactly where Ararat is. There is a mountain named Ararat, but we don't know for certain if that's it. But it's somewhere in the neighborhood of outside of Turkey, there getting into Afghanistan and that area up in the north there. But I knew that was going to happen. Here's what I want to get to. So now we see the genealogy of Noah. And I know everybody's just been waiting for us to get to this part of the scriptures, right? We're ready to start diving into the genealogies? No? Okay. So we have something that happens that's interesting in verse 18, chapter 9, verse 18. The sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. Recognize that? The father of Canaan. And there were 3 sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. So every one of us in this room come from one of Noah's sons. All right, so we look back at the genealogy of humankind. We know that Adam had multiple children. One of them was Abel, and one of them was Cain. Well, Abel was killed. Cain went on to live apart from the rest of civilization or mankind. But it was Seth, another child that Adam and Eve had, that you see this genealogy come through down to Noah. He also had other sons and daughters that we don't get much mention about, but all of mankind came from the lineage of Seth. And so the son of Adam, which you wind up with all this lineage down to Noah. And then you have Noah's 3 sons. And one of those sons, as it says right here, Ham, the father of Canaan. And that is already looking forward to what's going to happen whenever God sends Moses and Joshua into the land of Canaan. And we have this event where Noah raises up a vineyard, he gets drunk, apparently he is naked or something, and Ham doesn't do anything about it, but Shem and Japheth, they go and they cover up their father, and whenever Noah wakes up, verse 25, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brethren." So Noah had a son who didn't honor him. He's cursing that son to say, you're going to have a son that doesn't honor you. And it's interesting that the Canaanites that we get to later on, the Canaanites to this day, they are non-existent. They have become extinct. That race, that branch of humanity is completely extinct. So no one can apply this curse to themselves today. I just found that interesting as I was looking through genealogies and so forth. Then we get into chapter 10, and we get into more detail about Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And I want you to notice a few things. For example, down in chapter 10, verse 10, the beginning of the kingdom of Babel. This is through Nimrod, one of the sons of Ham, who then in verse 11 built Nineveh. Again, looking forward to what's going to be happening in the future. Verse 14, we see where the Philistines came from. And in verse 16, where the Jebusites came from. Those are the people who inhabited Jerusalem whenever David took it over. Then you get into Shem. I want you to look down in verse 28. Verse 28, Obal, Abimael, and Sheba. Does that name ring a bell? The queen of Sheba. So this is the beginning of that people. And then there's a little hiccup in between those 2 descendants and then the descendants of Shem that began in chapter 11, verse 10. And that is the story of the Tower of Babel. And real quick, it says that it came to pass as they journeyed. Well, let me back up. Chapter 11, verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and make them accordingly." And they had brick for stone, and they had asphalt. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower whose top is in the heavens, to make us a name for ourselves." A lot of people look at this and go, oh, the sin was building this tower, going up to heaven, trying to reach God. That's really not what the sin was about. The sin was about trying to make a name for themselves, and they gathered together and built a city. Nothing wrong with living in cities, but that's not what God wanted or commanded at the time. And so he didn't want them gathering together. He wanted them, as the command said, go and multiply and fill the earth. And notice it says, while they were going east, they stopped. And they build this city. And then they build this tower so that it says, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. So they're stopping. They're rebelling against what would be God's command to continue out throughout the earth. So, verse 6, God says that they have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be held from them. In other words, God knows man's future if it's left unabated. In other words, we've been down this road once before, and I destroyed the whole earth because of it. And so that's why you have come, let us, interesting, right, the Godhead, go down there and confuse their language that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from over the face of the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore it is called Babel, because the Lord confused the language. Now, this shows us part of God's plan is that he wanted them to spread out because he is going to sanctify one particular family that he's going to send the Messiah through. So if they all gather and they don't do what he says of propagating the earth, then that plan can't happen. Another fascinating thing real quick, and I'll leave you with this, is if you go and look at the history of languages. I'm a linguist. I love languages. I speak multiple languages. If you look at the history of them, you can trace it all the way back to the Semitic languages, which is where Hebrew and Arabic and everything, but it starts way back here and it begins to branch out till you get to all these languages. And then one of those branches takes off, which is where our English and Romance languages and Germanic and everything else comes from. But all those languages that we have today all trace back. You can trace them back by their roots. Find that rather fascinating. Any last comments, thoughts before we break for worship? Yeah. Capital punishment in the old law if you eat blood. Very good point. Anything else? All right, I hope this helped you know a little bit more about Genesis chapter 6 through 11. We'll continue next week, picking up in chapter 12.